I knew at that point that the path I was on, it was too worn, and I needed to find a new one.
What does it mean to be too worn?
Anytime you stay in your comfort zone too long, I think you're risking atrophy. But I was so comfortable. I was getting a steady paycheck. I had a really nice retirement plan. I was able to make my mortgage payments, no problem. So I was like, no, I'll just stay in my loop. I think this is very nice for me, and there's nothing wrong with being in the loop. But at the same time, I was hating my life every day. I'd wake up and my heart rate would go up 10 points as soon as we turned onto the street that my firm was located on, because I was like, I can't bear the thought of being dropped off for another day at the office. And it's like, but I thought that was what it meant to be an adult, is to hate your life.
Oh my gosh. The idea of atrophying is such an awesome thing to think about, because you're saying that even if you're doing something that was once productive, if you're doing it beyond the threshold of growth, you will not just stay the same, you will eventually atrophy. We live in a complex and ever-changing world, a place that is maybe harder than ever to successfully navigate. The answer is surely to be brave, but it's also to seek and be open to guidance. Mentors are the one consistent through line in the lives of all accomplished people, myself included. So welcome to Mentor Buffet, a feast for those, like me, curious about who helped the most successful among us succeed. JOANNE Molinaro is the Korean vegan. She's a foodfluencer and popped off online because she tells these crazy and personal stories while doing cooking tutorials. JOANNE also has been a lawyer for 20 years. She told me about 2 older women lawyers at her firm who have mentored her in the workplace, but also helped her learn to value herself more.
Anytime I came to her, and I went into her office many times crying, like, I made this huge mistake, or I don't know what to do, or I'm in panic mode, I suck, and blah, blah, blah. She could always tell me a mistake that she made that was bigger than mine. And the testament to her path was, I survived.
JOANNE also sees Rich Roll as a mentor.
I started listening to his podcast, and he's literally the only podcast that I listen to. When you have the same voice literally, going into your ears, how do you not internalize that voice to some degree, right? And all of the bits of wisdom.
His wisdom is the reason she's a vegan and why she made such a dramatic career pivot in her 30s to chase her dreams as a chef. I've learned so much about JOANNE. We talked about trusting yourself, we talked about making big changes, and so many other things. Here's my conversation with the Korean vegan, JOANNE Molinaro.
I always tell people I became a lawyer almost like, how like on multiple choice, like you just don't know the actual answer, so you pick the answer that seems the right choice. And that was really my career in a nutshell for nearly 2 decades, which was, well, I don't want to be a doctor because I faint at the sight of blood. I don't want to be a business person because I hate selling things. So I guess I'll just be a lawyer. Like, I don't really know what else to do with my future. But it was a very, very stressful job. It was a really hard one. And I was lucky that I had both a formal mentor and a host of informal mentors to sort of steer me in my legal career.
Okay, I want to hear about these women who mentored you at the practice and who I think some of them continue to be there for you. But you said something that I was like, oh shit. The idea that like when somebody asks you a question, you have to have an answer. And we ask kids when they're like 6 years old what they want to be when they grow up, right? And I'm very fascinated by it because I'm writing a play about this, because I think that question is like awful. It's so hard. Like, you ask a kid a question and kids want to be good, right? We all want to be good. And so you reach for the answer instead of maybe having the answer, and you reached for lawyer. How old were you when you answered that question for the first time?
I had just Well, I answered that question for the first time, like you just described. My parents were asking me, "What do you wanna be when you grow up?"
Yeah.
You know, and I was probably like, I don't know, 9,
Yes. Oh
and
my
I was
god.
like, "I guess I wanna be a psychiatrist," or something like that, and then that answer changed to teacher, and then that answer
Yeah.
changed to be a singer, and I wanna be a musician. I had that dream for a very long time, probably right up until I decided to become a lawyer. And what you talk about and what hopefully will make itself into the play or the screen play that you're writing was I had just graduated from college and I realized, oh my God, I need to pay for rent. I need to
Yeah.
pay for a car. I need to have insurance, all these adult things that I felt totally unprepared to do. And I was like, well, the only way I'm going to do that is to give up this stupid notion of being a singer and do something responsible with my life. And I decided, well, I have 3 options. I can be a doctor, I can be a business person, or I can be a lawyer. And of those 3 things, like you just described, I felt like I had to come up with an answer, so I just chose the one that was, like, the least despicable to me.
Right. Well, because we need something that will pay us, meaning we need something that people need, and we need to imagine ourselves filling that need, right? It's both something that the world needs and something that we feel confident that we can be.
I think that's the key, is you need to feel confident that you can fill and satisfy that need, and I had 0 confidence in my
Right.
ability to fill any artistic need. Like, I'm not an artist, I'm not good enough as a singer, I'm not talented enough because for better or worse, my parents made me feel like that was not my path, and so they fostered scholarship and writing and analysis and math and all of those other things. And I was like, okay, well, I feel relatively confident in those things. So even if
Right.
that's not really what I want to do, that's the only thing I know how to do. So I guess I'll pick something like that.
Right. And what was it that made you say, I am good at this, that would make me a lawyer?
That's a really great question. I was relying almost exclusively on grades. My report card, my GPA. I graduated from college a year early. I tested extremely high in the LSATs. Like all of these very structured measures of value and worth, which ultimately became extremely useless when I ended up joining a law firm and no longer had these very objective measures of my value. It
Oh.
actually ended up hurting me a lot. It was the source of a great deal of anxiety for me because you don't get graded when you're a lawyer. You don't get an A+ on your memo or on your brief. Like these are not things that happen, but I had grown so used to that as a measure of who I was and how good I was and how confident I was allowed to be that when that whole apparatus disappeared, I had to come up with something else, and that was really hard.
Yeah, wait, but as a lawyer, don't you win or lose?
No,
Is that a dumb question to ask?
it's not. It's a great question to
Sorry, I'm
ask,
like,
but
wait.
that's like literally 5%.
Right, and so I imagine that these 2 mentors that we're gonna talk about might have did they come in that intersection point? So tell me about them.
So I had 2 mentors that I kind of think of every time I look back at my legal career. The first one, her name is Ellen. She was the assigned mentor. So her talent, her superpower was anytime I came to her, and I went into her office many times crying, like, I made this huge mistake, or I don't know what to do, or like, I'm in panic mode, I suck, and blah, blah, blah. She could always tell me a mistake that she made that was bigger than mine. And the testament to her path was I survived. I'm still
Mm.
here to tell you this funny story about how I made an even worse mistake than you did. And it's okay. You'll survive because I did. And you'll also have a really great sense of humor about it because I do. And I think that was just such a wonderful thing to know that you don't need to be absolutely perfect, which is what I felt like I had to be, particularly those first few years in the practice, is that you can make mistakes and that's okay. You'll survive and you'll be better for it because you'll learn from them.
It's so cool that Ellen, as a mentor, was mentoring you with her own anecdotes of failure that topped yours instead of just telling you why she was better than you and what you could learn from her.
100%.
That's really unique. That is like really, really, really unique. I don't know, when I think about a mentor, I think about someone who's like handing you wisdom and not playing little VHS tapes to you of their shortcomings. You know, that's awesome.
That was her gift. She was so good at that, and she's also like so funny and really sarcastic, and I really needed that, and she knew that.
How does somebody hold those two things at the same time? How do you laugh at yourself and want more out of yourself at the same time? Or is it just you just do? Or
Well, I think that's a really very good question, and also it's a very astute observation. I think there are certain environments that demand that of you. Like, that's the default setting, and that's certainly the law firm. There's no room for sitting back and, just, like, letting things happen to you. Like, you will fail, like, really badly if you take on that mentality at a law firm. There's, like, always this sort of urgency, kind of, like, underlying your day-to-day, whether it's you gotta meet this deadline, you gotta answer this email, you gotta answer this client. So, it's almost impossible to ever feel like, "Oh, I'm content with who I am here, like, I'm okay," you know? It's just I've never felt that. I don't think that's unique to me. I think that's just part of the environment.
what I'm like really hearing is that having a sense of humor is actually an act of slowing down because it's kind of honoring what just happened in a way that is it's a mental couch, right? To make a joke, you're sitting on a couch a little bit, right? You're kind of like lounging in your own
Mhm.
mistake. I don't know how else to describe a
I think
joke.
that's a perfect way to describe it, and it is you're right. Now that I think about it, that was the other thing I loved about going into Ellen's office. She she never brushed me off. She never said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I've got a meeting," or I have to take this phone call. And that was 90% of what happened anytime I went into anyone else's office.
Mm.
For her, it was like, "You're here. I'm gonna drop everything that I'm doing." And again, if you know anything about law firm life, we live and die by the billable hour. So at any minute that we cannot bill to a client, that is precious, precious time. And so she was willing to sometimes sacrifice 2.0 billable hours for me so I could sit there and she could make me laugh, or she could, cry with me, or she could, tell me to get my shit together. That was an actual slowing of time, and I think that was one of the lovely things about going into her office was that I could sit on her, metaphorical couch or sometimes literal couch. We were at one point allowed to have couches. And it was just nice to know that she wasn't gonna, hush me out of here. Like, hey, I got things to do. She never did that. And like you said, being able to kind of luxuriate in whatever emotion we had available to us, whether it was laughter or sadness or intense anxiety, she was always able to kind of help me observe those things and then laugh at them a little bit and walk out feeling like, okay, it's more manageable. Maybe it's not gone, but it's manageable.
Yeah. It reminds me of like I was a Girl Scout and I was like, oh, I feel like I'm still a Girl Scout because I never quit.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm not really a Girl Scout. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome that you could just be something forever. I mean, I'm sure you still talk to
I
Ellen,
do. Mhm.
but she's not assigned to you anymore, is she? Or is she always assigned to you?
She was never unassigned to me, and so I always tell her, "You're still my mentor."
Yeah.
Like, I always say to her, I'm like, "They will take you away from me, when I'm dead," basically. And I still work at the firm, and she's probably an assigned mentor to many younger associates and attorneys by now, and they're very lucky to have her, but they gotta know that they will always be sharing her with me.
Right. Well, wow. Okay, I went to Disneyland for my birthday last week.
Oh, wow. I was in
And,
Disneyland last week.
You were?
Yes.
That's awesome. It's fun to go to Disneyland as an adult.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah.
So I went, and this reminds me of, so I walked into Toontown with my friend Colleen, and we had no business in Toontown. We were not kids. We didn't have kids with us. This is a kid area, right? But we wandered by Minnie's house, and we were like, who's waiting 60 minutes with their kid to meet Minnie? Like, why are people doing this? Is it that great? We didn't really want to wait in lines. We were finding all the systems and things. And then we walk by the house in between Minnie and Mickey's house. There's Minnie. and she's at this little tea table, and we watch, and she greets, there's a line of 60 minutes worth of kids, right? And she greets the kid that comes up, and she spins them around, and she hugs them, and she signs their autograph, and the kid feels like they are the only kid in the entire universe. And it was, I cannot tell you how much I felt magic. And then the kid goes on their way. Minnie immediately grabs the next kid, and the next kid feels like they're the only kid in the universe. And I feel like what you're saying about Ellen is like, has a little, it has I'm going to use your word, a flair of that, of this like one-on-one quality relationship, where everybody feels they have that space with her. That's cool that people can do that for each other outside of Disneyland.
Oh,
you
no.
know?
I mean, maybe they learned from watching Disney. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
but you're exactly right. I had a moment like that myself when I was at Disney. I saw,
Talk about
yeah,
Disneyland, I
I saw
love
the princesses, in their full regalia, like coming out. And then all of a sudden, the 6-year-old girl who fell in love with Cinderella was like, I want to touch you.
Yeah.
Like it just, there is some magic in not just Disneyland, but this idea that there are women out there who are bigger than us or who have stories inside of them that could somehow elicit the stories from ourselves. And that's what Ellen did so well, is she made me feel safe, and she made me feel welcome, and she made me feel seen.
So you had Ellen, and you had another mentor at the practice, right? Who was not an assigned mentor, but was someone who came to you more naturally.
Yeah. I was in a very bad relationship. I was in a very unhealthy relationship at home. And I would often come to work, and it was like clear, like emotionally, that I just drained. Like I had nothing in me because I was dealing with stuff at home. And I would talk to Jill about it on occasion, as with Ellen. And this is what I always did, because, and I think a lot of women can probably relate to this, is I would make excuses for him. I'd say, this isn't his fault. This is my fault. I should have done this, or I'm selfish. I would say this to Jill all the time. I would say, I'm a bad person. Jill, you don't know me. I'm not a good person. I'm a selfish person, and I deserve this.
Were you told you were selfish? Or
Oh, yeah, multiple times. I was told that I was any number of bad things and that it was my fault. And I would rather hear that it was my fault than it was anybody else's, because I can control me. I can't control anybody else. So I loved hearing that it was my fault, because then I could fix it, right, theoretically. So when Jill or Ellen would say things like, "But is it really?" I was convincing myself that it was by convincing them. But of course, they were never convinced. And then finally, one day, after hearing this for the, I don't know, 100th time, Jill just started crying. She started sobbing. And she was like, you have no idea how much it kills me to see you being brainwashed into thinking you're a bad person. She's like, you're not a bad person. I see you. And to see you turning into this is killing me. And so she knew that I'm empathetic to her, and that like her appeal to that was very effective. And I remember sitting there being like, well, I don't want to believe I'm a bad person either.
Right.
Like, is that really what's happening to me? Like, is that what's happening to me? And I think that really clicked. And I was like, oh, this is not okay. I really do need to find a way out of this, because I don't want to believe I'm a bad person either. That was very pivotal moment for me.
Right. So you had people you trusted and admire kind of almost embody the feelings that you didn't let yourself feel, right? And I've done this too, where you're like, there are things that are unfeelable for whatever reason, right? And that's very, it's awesome how clear you describe why you wanted it to be your fault. Like, that's a very helpful thing for me to hear, and helpful for, I'm sure, a lot of people to hear, because it is weird to want that, but it makes sense the way you put it. So you can rely on people you trust, your friends, your mentors, to understand what the real feelings might be. And also, like, probably to slow down and look at the definitions of these character shaming words, and figure out, is the definition of this word what I'm actually doing? For example, the word selfish is having no regard for others. And if someone just calls you selfish over and over again and gives like real world context, we might internalize it. But if you just simply say, have no regard for others, I'm sure there's other definitions of the word, then you absolutely know that that's not you,
Mm.
right? Because you're like, when someone says you're this because you did this, it's harder to know if you're this, right? You're selfish because you drank my coffee or whatever. But once you look at the definition of a word, and I think this is like, man, words are really powerful and really dangerous, because if we really look at that word, it's like, do you have no regard for others? You know that that's not true, right? Uh,
Decontextualize it, as you
That's what I
say.
mean. Is like,
Yeah.
and maybe we all need to like think for a second and just say like, all these words that we're like calling ourselves or that people are calling us, whatever, we do need to decontextualize it.
If you already come at that relationship thinking you're not worthy of it, which I always did, you know, even if it was a toxic relationship, he was my first love.
Yeah.
And so like I never believed that I was good enough for him. And so I also think it was because I loved him so much. I was willing to do anything, like
Mm.
literally anything to preserve that relationship, even if it meant telling myself these little white lies. Yeah, you're right, I am selfish. Even though you're right, decontextualized, I knew, well, no, I certainly have regard for other people. In fact, that's literally why I'm here.
Yes, that's
you
what
know?
I mean is like you
Yeah.
might be the opposite.
Exactly.
And that's super helpful. Like it's super helpful, and it's obviously amazing that these women in the workplace were willing to kind of like
Totally.
gently but firmly and effectively help you.
Well, I think it's
Uh,
exactly what you said. They embodied these emotions that I wasn't allowing myself to really grapple with. And they're like, fine, we'll just do it right in front of your
yeah,
face.
we'll just do it for
Yeah.
it's very generous. And it's like it's necessary
It
sometimes.
was totally necessary for me. I will never forget it. I bring it up to Jill all the time. She's probably like sick to death of hearing it. She's like, yeah, I know, I changed your life. But honestly, like
Okay.
anytime somebody asks me like, who are the mentors, she will always be on that list because of that one conversation that I so vividly remember.
And it can happen in one conversation, right? And it can happen remotely, as it did with you and Rich at
Yeah.
first.
It wasn't a conversation, it was a one-sided conversation.
No, it was you taking in a satellite mentor, right? And assigning it to yourself.
Exactly.
Tell me about the first time you met Rich in the audio atmosphere,
Yes. So my husband, he had picked up Rich's book, Finding Ultra, and he fell in love with it and decided he was going to go vegan. And I was like, okay, well, I don't want to go vegan. And I don't know what book you're reading, but it's probably full of crap because veganism is not healthy and blah, blah, blah. Just all these silly, silly notions. But because we were in a fairly new relationship, I wanted to at least see like what he was talking about. So I read Rich's book as well at the time, and I found so much of it relatable because he was a lawyer, because he was disenchanted with his career, and I started listening to his podcast. Eventually, I went vegan as well, and he's literally the only podcast that I listen to. I didn't really listen to any others. I mean, maybe one-offs here and there, but he was the only one that I listened to with regularity. And it's interesting, as I'm sure you can relate to, when you have the same voice literally, going into your ear, especially because I was a long distance runner at some point. I mean, I just listened to all of his podcasts while I was doing long runs and things like that. I listened to his book on audio subsequently after that as well. And it's just like, how do you not internalize that voice to some degree, right? And all of the bits of wisdom. And I know he's sort of curating that wisdom with his guests, but ultimately it was through his lens and through his kind of probing inquiry and his curiosity and sometimes even his struggle to find answers. I was on that journey with him. And in some weird way, he was on my own journey too, even though he had no idea who I was, right?
Well, and when we think about way back when you were asked what you wanted to be when you grow up, that was the wrong question to ask you, right? Like you could have been asked any of the questions that Rich is asking his guests, and that would have been a better question for somebody to ask you.
That really made me feel like a fellowship with him, despite the fact, again, like you note, I didn't know him and he didn't know me, but I felt like I was getting to know him through the podcast and his voice and his writing and even on social media, because of course I followed him on Instagram immediately. And so But you're right. He was asking all of these questions. And ultimately, I listened to a podcast of him and, this author who wrote this amazing book called Range.
Mhm.
And they were talking about, making a switch in your career, sometimes a drastic one, at midlife, not having all of the answers in your 20s and that being okay. Not even having all your answers in your 30s or even in your 40s, constantly evolving into the person that is your best version. And I just remember feeling like, okay, well, I can see why this resonates with Rich because obviously he found the path that he's currently on at, what many people would say in midlife, right? And it resonated with me because I think I knew at that point that the path I was on, it was too worn and I needed to
Mhm.
find a new one.
What does it mean to be too worn?
I think it means that I was running around in circles. You know what I mean? It's like I wasn't actually going anywhere. I was just running around in circles. And so the groove that I was creating was just this repetition of day in and day out with no purpose and no real direction. It was just, well, this is comfortable for me. I know it. It's like the loop here, the lake,
Yeah,
right? The lake
yeah,
loop, the
yeah.
4 mile lake loop. It's like I
Mm.
just keep doing it over and over and over again instead of kind of venturing off into the hills, into these neighboring hills because it's comfortable for me. And that's what happened.
Okay, I wanna talk about this loop because some people, like, dedicate themselves to a loop, right? They do a specific craft, and maybe it more correlates to a purpose, which is something you said that you didn't feel you had, but they're okay on that loop, and the grooves become designs or something, right? So, for you, was it like, because there's what you're actually doing with your time in the loop, and then there's what your mind how your mind is growing by being on the loop over and over again, and so, for you, mostly because I don't think you want to mislead people into saying that the loop is inherently bad. It's not the loop, it's what you are, how you're engaging with it, right? So for you, you were doing something maybe something comfortable for you eventually by
Mhm.
being on the loop, and you also weren't growing mentally on that loop.
I was not. I was totally stunted. I like anytime you stay in your comfort zone too long, I think you're risking atrophy. And that's what was happening to me, an emotional,
Okay.
spiritual, intellectual atrophy, certainly an artistic atrophy. But I was so comfortable. I was getting a steady paycheck. I had a really nice retirement plan. I was able to make my mortgage payments, no problem. These are things that to me, I didn't ever want to jeopardize. And I thought that's what I had to. I had to risk all of those things in order to do anything outside of the loop. So I was like, no, I'll just stay in my loop. I think this is very nice for me. And there's nothing wrong with being in the loop. But at the same time, I was hating my life every day. I'd wake up and my heart rate would go up 10 points as soon as we turned onto the street that my firm was located on because I was like, I can't bear the thought of being dropped off for another day at the office. And it's like, but I thought that was what it meant to be an adult is to hate your life.
Oh my gosh. The idea of atrophying is such an awesome thing to think about because you're saying that even if you're doing something that was once productive, if you're doing it beyond the threshold of growth, you will not just stay the same, you will eventually atrophy. But that's like very observant of yourself. And it's not like inherent that you'd atrophy. It's like you had to notice that about yourself, right?
I think it's easier to say that in hindsight,
Sure,
right?
sure.
I think at the time, what I realized I had one massive growth spurt in 2013, which is when I exited my first marriage. That was like I learned so much from that experience. And then, when I was listening to this podcast episode, I felt like okay, I'm being nudged again, like physically leaving the front door of my home at that time was everything to me in terms of growing and stepping into a new me, right? And I think that listening to that episode of the podcast was another nudge saying, okay, you've spent enough time in this house. It's now time for you to walk out the door and see what's out there. But I was scared. I didn't want to. I was like, but
Yeah.
I like it here. It's really nice and comfortable here.
It's also hard to change more than one thing at a time.
It is.
Like,
It is. It
right?
is.
Like that's really it's enough to change one major thing in your marriage, and then to have been sort of summoned by this podcast you came across, and then to change something else. That's real rare territory, you
It was
know?
scary, but I'm so grateful for it. And I remember I was actually running. It's so funny. I was running the same exact loop that I often did in Lincoln Park. And I remember, like, again, so vividly, just like this feeling of terror, but also liberation.
Mm.
Like I just remember feeling like, oh, just on the other side of this, I can smell freedom,
Yes.
but I just don't have the courage yet to walk through the door, or even
Yeah.
like the mechanics of how to unlock this door, but I can really smell it. And that was like the first time I'd ever smelled it, like that kind of freedom. And I was very intrigued.
Yeah. I like the idea that it's a smell.
Yeah. I felt it.
Oh,
Yeah.
I love it as a smell because everybody has like the smell, right? Because the reason why the smell is so awesome, the idea that it's a smell, is because if you call it a feeling, there's too much responsibility on yourself to sense the feeling. And if we go back to like your experience, with Ellen, with Jill, like maybe you don't trust that you will have the feeling and engage with it, right? At least I feel that way. I'm assuming you might have felt that way too. So the smell is in the world and you smell it. It's almost like you either smell it or you don't. And if you smell it, there's something over there. There's some cookies, there's some stew, there's like something out there that you're curious about, and it's a feeling of potential. That's what I'm hearing, right?
Yes.
And you're hella curious about what that potential could be, and you don't know what the dish is yet, right? Because you're still like in the rainforest of like chaos or whatever, but you can smell something over there, and then you just follow the smell. And I think that's such an awesome thing to like, for me to learn from you, because I have smells all the time, and to kind of like take them out of myself a little bit and not have them be a feeling feels way easier for me all of a sudden, because I'm like, it's just a smell. It just is. There is a smell.
I love that. I think it allows you to put your observational cap on instead of like, oh, I've got to now name this thing. I've got to
Yes.
engage with it. I've got to deal with
And
it.
take ownership as if you created
Yeah,
the
you
smell.
created it.
No, the
Yeah.
curiosity is just there.
Yeah.
It's like our thoughts. Like we don't think to have a thought. We have thoughts. The smells just
They are there.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
there. If we're like living any kind of life where we're interacting with the world at all or making changes or like anything, right? Anything other than just loop on loop.
Yeah,
loop.
in your brain. Yeah, exactly. Mhm.
Have you ever been able to tell Rich? I know he knows his influence on you, right? But have you directly expressed that to him? And what would it mean for you to tell him kind of just straight up what that meant to you?
That's a great question. I think it depends on how you define directly. Um, Obviously, I was a guest on his podcast in 2021, and I always tell people, I don't know if I've ever told him, but I've always told people, like, I did not physically react to that situation in the way that I thought. I just remember the hour leading up to his podcast. I actually had a photo shoot with the LA Times because they were doing a lovely piece on me. And so they're like, oh, we're going to do a photo shoot of you in your hotel room. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm here for this other podcast. And it's like timing, and I just remember being like super stressed out about that. But it was really great because it like took my mind off of being nervous about the podcast. And then they left like an hour before I had to head over to the studio. And then all of a sudden, like the nerves just like crash in on me. And I was like, I can't even talk right now. I'm like not able to speak. I'm literally going to meet this man that like for all intents and purposes was like a hero to me, right? And not just to me, he was also that to my husband. So like we were both like, I think my husband's like way cool, but I was not cool. And we're driving in and we get to the studio and we knock on the door and he wasn't actually there in the beginning and we're like being ushered into the place where we're going to be recording and then he just shows up and I just remember I'm going to freaking throw up all over this person. I was like, my like first feeling was like so nauseous and like so overwhelmed and like, I can't believe this is happening. This is so surreal. And like, please don't throw up all over this man. Like, that was like all I could think about. It's just
sorry, I'm just laughing. I'm laughing at, I don't think he'd get like Rich would be okay if you threw up
If
on
I
him.
threw
I
up.
think he could handle it, but oh my God. So you're super nervous. Why are you so nervous to meet Rich Roll?
I think it was just because it's just, almost like, I grew up reading literature my whole life. So it would have been like meeting Lizzie Bennett, from Pride and Prejudice or, meeting the Babysitters Club or like, these are just like huge icons in my brain. And to see them take on 3D, there was like so much anticipation and like, what if he hates me? Or what if I don't live up to, his expectations of me? Or even worse, what if this hero that I had in my head turns out to be a jerk,
Right.
or like not cool, or like, then what does that mean for every decision I've made based upon his counsel,
Right.
like
Right.
is that all fake, like, so there's just like a lot kind of going into it. And then, of course, also I was going to be on this podcast that I had worshipped for years and years and years, with, hundreds of thousands of listeners on a daily basis. Like that was also something to be frightened of. So, we had our 2.5 hour podcast. It went great. We chatted afterwards where I did, of course, tell him, I've been following you forever. And I loved your book. You're why I became vegan and all this other stuff. And ultimately I did a TikTok kind of saying as much, which he saw and he shared on his own social media platform. So in that way, I did communicate that to him. But I honestly think that if I were like in a room with him and I was like, hey, Rich, I need to tell you how much you changed my life, I think it would be incredibly awkward for both of us.
No. Why? Why? No, we need to let, why? We need to let people tell people that and that I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's like I think it's like important that we feel comfortable telling people how much they've helped us or changed us or how much because it's not hurting anybody.
Oh, no, it isn't. I think that, I grew up in a family where any real expression of emotions was very frowned upon. And so it's just not comfortable for
Right,
me
it's
to
not.
say or to hear. So I do it in my own like weird oblique way, which is like, oh, I'll just post about it on social media to millions of people and hopefully you'll
Yes.
see it.
Well, it seems like what you're doing is you've shed what we talked about earlier was you really placing heavy emphasis on knowing that shows up with grades. It shows up with knowing that you were the one in the relationship that was the problem, even though you weren't. And that was like a tent pole of, it was how you oriented, right? But to see your present self from the vantage point of a future self is to make an assumption that your future self is going to grow and see this differently. And so it really is like a surrendering of knowing, but just assuming and trusting that based on the growth you've had so far, you will assume a life of growth and emotional maturity and perspective that is in your favor. And that's awesome, right? Like, because it's kind of like, it's sort of like less, I don't know if it's like egotistical or something, but it is sort of letting go that you know everything now. It's basically saying, actually, in 20 years, I'm going to know a lot more. And I know that I'll know a lot more. So maybe there's still a knowing in there, but it's a knowing that you don't know how you'll feel about yourself and assuming that it's going to be good.
Well, I think it's certainly evidence-based, which is important to me, because we have history to prove that, many, many years of history. But you're right, it is a bit of a surrendering. It's trusting yourself. I always tell people the cornerstone to confidence is believing that you're a good person. Like, that's the most important thing. Are you a good person? Do you get up every day and try to do the right thing? You don't always do it, but at least do you try? Do you want to? Is that something that you want to do? Be a good person. And if you can answer that question very honestly, yes, I do. I do try to do the right thing. I do believe I'm a good person. Then you can trust in yourself no matter what happens, no matter what decisions you ultimately make, where you are in 20 years. If all of those decisions begin and end with, yes, I'm a good person, then yeah, you can lean back and
Mm.
trust in yourself.
Amazing. Well, Joanne, I am so grateful to have you on the Mentor Buffet.
Yay.
Thank you for sharing about your mentors, and thank you for like bringing such a, I mean, you're wearing a cropped sweatshirt, which is amazing because you said that your heart is just out. And I'm like, it sure is.
It's
You're
like
literally
right here.
wearing no sweatshirt over your heart.
Right.
So I appreciate that about you. And I'm glad that I've made a new mentor today too. So
Well,
thank you.
thank you very much.
Cheers to the Mentor
Cheers,
Buffet.
yay,
We did it.
cheers,
Yeah,
yay.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you're enjoying Mentor Buffet, follow Voicing Change for more inspirational and truly life-affirming content from shows like Soul Boom, The Proof, Feel Better, Live More, and the Rich Roll podcast. Just go to voicingchange.media. That's voicingchange.media for a beautiful selection of productive and positive shows.